Dive Podcast, straight talk on politics, national security, and America's future. With Robert Johnson and Linda Miller, we cut through the spin, tackle the tough issues, and give you the real story behind today's headlines. Subscribe now and hit the notification bell to stay informed.
Welcome to the Deep Dive.
Great to be here.
Today, we're really plunging into the details, aren't we? Looking at that second round of negotiations between Russia and Ukraine, the one held recently in Istanbul.
Yeah, it's a complex one. After a bit of a break, these direct talks kicked off again, and, well, the source material we've got suggests there were some pretty significant exchanges, proposals flying back and forth.
Absolutely, and that's our mission for this deep dive, really. To cut through all the noise, unpack the key details based only on the information we have from the sources.
Exactly. We're focusing on the nitty-gritty. What proposals were actually on the table, what practical things might have been agreed, even provisionally, and the wider international picture as it was presented in the material.
We want to give you the clearest possible picture of what actually happened during those talks, straight from the source info.
Think of it like this. We've waded through the documents, the reports, and now we're here to sort of guide you through the important bits. What was said and what the sources suggest it might mean.
Okay, let's dive in then. Setting the scene first. Istanbul. The sources pinpoint the date as June 2nd and the location, the Sirigan Palace.
Right, quite a grand setting. And the key players, the heads of the delegations, were Vladimir Medinsky for Russia and Rustem Umarov for Ukraine. That's what the sources name.
And also present, playing a mediating role it seems, was Turkish Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan.
His presence seems quite important, especially when you look at how the meeting was structured.
Yeah, the structure described in the source material is fascinating. The main talks, with the full delegations apparently only lasted about an hour, which seems short.
It does, yeah, for talks like these. But here's the kicker, according to the sources. Medinsky and Umarov, the two lead negotiators, had a separate, much longer meeting before that main session.
How long are we talking?
2.5 hours, just them and Turkish Foreign Minister Fidan.
Wow, okay. 2.5 hours beforehand. And the sources seem to think this wasn't just a warm-up.
Not at all. The material we have explicitly states this pre-meeting predetermined the effective course of further negotiations. That's a direct quote from the reporting.
Predetermined. So the suggestion is that the real groundwork, maybe the core sticking points or potential agreements, were thrashed out in that smaller, longer session.
Seems likely, based on that description. It wasn't just setting the agenda. It sounds like it set the actual trajectory for the hour that followed with the main teams.
The sources also mentioned the language used Russian, apparently.
Yes, conducted in Russian. And there was a comment afterwards from Turkish President Erdogan. He reportedly called the negotiations magnificent.
High praise. Did he elaborate?
He did suggest, interestingly, that if the sides could agree to a leaders' meeting, Russian President Putin and the Ukrainian president, then maybe potentially U.S. President Trump could join that meeting.
Bringing Trump into a potential leaders' summit. That's quite a suggestion from the host. Adds another layer of complexity, doesn't it?
It certainly does. Shows the high stakes and the potential international dimensions being considered, at least by Turkey.
Okay, so beyond the setting and the structure, let's get to the substance. What immediate practical outcomes or concrete discussions did the sources reveal?
Well, one of the most immediate and, frankly, grim points was about the exchange of bodies. Medinsky for the Russians was reported as saying Russia would unilaterally transfer 6,000 bodies of deceased Ukrainian servicemen.
Unilaterally, that's the Russian framing.
Yes. But then you look at the Ukrainian side's reporting. According to the sources, Umarov announced a body exchange too, but he framed it based on a 6,000 for 6,000 formula.
Ah, okay. So one side says unilateral transfer, the other says a reciprocal 6,000 for 6,000 deal. Even on something practical like this, the framing differs.
Really highlights the difficulty, doesn't it? And tied into that, obviously, is the issue of prisoners of war. The sources described a prisoner exchange agreement discussed here as potentially the largest scale one agreed so far.
Largest scale. That definitely grabs your attention. What specifics did the sources give on who would be exchanged?
They specified categories. All the heavily wounded and heavily ill servicemen from both sides, and also, interestingly, young soldiers specifically aged 18 to 25.
Okay, so focused groups. And the formula for these groups?
For those categories, heavily wounded, ill, and the young soldiers, the formula mentioned was all for all.
Which, within those specific groups, means everyone fitting that description gets exchanged, right? Not necessarily all prisoners held by both sides overall.
Exactly. It's an all for all, within those defined parameters. And the sources even gave a sense of numbers, though maybe not final.
What kind of numbers are we talking about?
A minimum scale mentioned was at least 1,000 people from each side, potentially more, as they finalize the lists. But even 1,000 each is, well, it's significant.
Definitely a large number for a single exchange.
And linked to the heavily wounded point, there was another practical agreement mentioned, setting up permanent medical commissions.
Permanent commissions? What for?
The idea, as reported, is that these commissions would determine eligibility for exchanging the heavily wounded based purely on medical grounds using medical conclusions.
So it takes it out of the realm of needing a big political deal every time. Makes it more routine.
That seems to be the intention described in the sources, to allow these specific humanitarian exchanges for the most severely injured to happen more regularly, based on medical need, rather than waiting for major negotiation breakthroughs.
That sounds like a potentially positive practical step if implemented.
It does. Beyond the exchanges, though, Russia also brought a proposal about the fighting itself, a localized ceasefire.
Localized, okay. Not a general one, then.
No, the sources specified it was for 2 to 3 days, and only on separate parts of the front. Very specific.
And the reason given?
Purely humanitarian, according to the Russian side's explanation, to allow commanders to retrieve the bodies of fallen soldiers from the gray zone, that no man's land between the lines.
Why the urgency on that?
Medinsky reportedly cited the heat, the risk of disease, unsanitary conditions, basically the decomposing bodies posing a health risk. He also apparently noted that Russian forces are advancing, meaning, in their view, more Ukrainian bodies are in that gray zone currently.
Yeah, connecting it to the battlefield situation. And what did they want Ukraine to do about this proposal?
The request reported was for Ukrainian military specialists to look at it, work on it, and do so quickly. It was framed as an urgent, practical battlefield necessity.
So even before we get to the big political stuff, there's this layer of immediate human cost issues being tackled.
Yeah.
The dead, the prisoners, these localized pauses, significant in themselves.
Absolutely. And perhaps discussing these practical points first help pave the way, or at least set the stage for the main event, the exchange of written memorandums outlining their broader proposals for a ceasefire or settlement.
Right. This is where the really deep divides become clear, isn't it?
Yeah.
The sources indicated Ukraine sent its document over earlier, maybe end of May, and wanted to see Russia's first.
Let's break down Ukraine's memorandum first, based on what the sources reported. It seems to have been structured into several key sections.
Okay, what's in Section 1?
Key principles and the ceasefire. It reportedly proposed a full and unconditional ceasefire air, land, sea for at least 30 days. And importantly, it could be extended monthly.
Full and unconditional. And how would it be monitored?
This is interesting. Ukraine proposed monitoring by the U.S. with help from other countries. So putting the U.S. in a central monitoring role.
And humanitarian demands.
Yes, very specific ones. The return of all Ukrainian children will definitely need to circle back to the details on that issue later. And an all-for-all exchange covering both prisoners and what they termed civilian hostages.
Civilian hostages, that phrasing is pointed. What about the big political stuff, status, security?
That was a major section, obviously. Ukraine insisted on international security guarantees. And critically, the sources say they explicitly rejected being forced into neutrality.
So no neutral status. What did they assert instead?
Their right to choose their own security paths, their own future. The sources quote the memorandum saying Ukraine can choose to be part of the Euro-Atlantic community and strive for membership in the European Union. That's a very clear Western orientation.
And NATO. What did it say about NATO membership?
It reportedly acknowledged that joining NATO requires consensus within the alliance. It's not just Ukraine's call. But, and this is key, the document apparently excluded any limitations on the size, armament, or deployment of Ukraine's own armed forces.
No limits on their own military. And what about foreign troops?
Also explicitly excluded limitations on deploying troops from friendly countries on Ukrainian soil. So basically, full military sovereignty asserted no externally imposed limits, neutrality, or demilitarization.
Okay, that's a strong stance. What about territory? That's obviously huge.
The section on territory, as reported, said these issues could only be discussed after a ceasefire was properly in place.
Only after a ceasefire. And the substance.
It insisted that any Russian territorial gains after 2014 would not get international recognition. So, a flat rejection of the Crimea annexation and the later claimed annexations in the East and South. Unequivocal. What else was in there? Sanctions, assets. Yep, a section on that. It proposed a way to gradually lift sanctions on Russia, but importantly, with a mechanism to quickly snap them back if needed, like an enforcement lever.
A snapback mechanism. Interesting. And the frozen assets.
Proposed using frozen Russian assets to fund Ukraine's reconstruction, directly linking Russia's frozen funds to paying for the recovery.
And finally, any mention of a leaders' meeting.
Yes, it reportedly mentioned the possibility of a meeting between the Russian and Ukrainian presidents, specifically to hash out a final peace treaty.
Okay, so summing up Ukraine's proposal as reported. Assert sovereignty, seek Western integration and guarantees, reject neutrality and military limits, demand territorial integrity back to pre-2014 lines, link sanctions relief to compliance, use frozen assets for reconstruction, and hold talks only after a ceasefire. That's quite a package.
It is. Now let's contrast that with Russia's memorandum, based on reports from sources like TASS and RIA Novosti. Medinsky, their lead negotiator, apparently framed it carefully.
How so?
He reportedly said it was not an ultimatum, but a comprehensive proposal. The aim, he said, was real peace, or at least a ceasefire, a big step towards long-term peace.
Okay, so how was it structured?
Sources describe two main parts, plus a third section on implementation steps. Part 1 was titled something like, How to Achieve Real Long-Term Peace.
And what were the key proposals under that heading? These seem to directly counter Ukraine's points.
Absolutely. First, the withdrawal of Ukrainian armed forces from the territories of DNR, LNR, Zaporozhye, and Kherson regions. Note that includes areas Russia claims but doesn't fully control militarily. The proposal specified Ukrainian troops must pull back to an agreed distance from what Russia now considers its borders.
Right, withdrawal from all those claimed territories.
Then, international legal recognition of the inclusion of Crimea, LNR, DNR, Zaporozhye, and Kherson into Russia. Essentially demanding the world accept the annexations, a complete non-starter for Ukraine, based on their memo.
A total clash on territory. What about Ukraine's status?
Russia proposed a neutral and non-nuclear status for Ukraine. No military alliances like NATO, no nukes. This is a core, long-standing Russian demand.
Directly contradicting Ukraine's desire to choose its own path. And the military size.
Russia proposed establishing maximum limits on the size and weaponry of Ukraine's army and National Guard. Again, the opposite of Ukraine's position of no limitations.
What else was in this long-term peace section? Anything about internal Ukrainian affairs?
Yes, several points. Ensuring rights for the Russian-speaking population, lifting restrictions on the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, UOC, the one historically tied to Moscow, and prohibiting the glorification of Nazism.
Including the UOC status. Yeah. That really shows how deep these issues run, blending politics, culture, religion.
Definitely. The first part also proposed mutual lifting of sanctions and restrictive measures, and both sides waiving claims for damages caused by the war.
Wiping the slate clean on sanctions and damages.
That's the proposal. And restoring relations, diplomatic, economic, including gas transit, transport links, even with third countries involved, and resolving family reunification issues.
So, part 1 is Russia's vision of the end state. Ukraine, territorially reduced, militarily limited, neutral, with specific internal conditions met, and then a normalization of relations.
Pretty much. Then part 2 detailed the steps for a full-fledged ceasefire. This is called a package proposal, meaning presumably all conditions had to be met.
A package deal for a ceasefire. What were the conditions?
Several key ones. Prohibition of any troop redeployment by Ukraine once the ceasefire starts.
Okay, freeze forces in place.
Cessation of mobilization in Ukraine. Stop calling up new troops.
Right. What else?
This is a big one. Cessation of supplies of foreign military aid to Kyiv. Cut off the Western arms flow.
Wow, okay. That's huge.
Along with that, the start of demobilization of Ukraine's existing forces.
So stop reinforcements, stop foreign aid, and start downsizing the army. All as conditions for a ceasefire.
That's what the sources report. Plus, excluding any military presence of third countries on Ukrainian territory. And finally, a guaranteed refusal by Ukraine to conduct any sabotage and subversive activities against Russia.
So this isn't just stop shooting. Russia's ceasefire proposal, as reported, demands fundamental changes to Ukraine's military capacity and international support before or as the ceasefire takes hold.
Exactly. It's a ceasefire heavily conditioned on Ukrainian military and policy shifts.
And the third section laid out the timeline, the sequence.
Yes, a very specific order of steps. First, start actually working on the text of a final peace treaty.
Okay, start drafting.
Then, declare that specific 2-3 day localized ceasefire we talked about earlier, just for collecting bodies from the gray zone.
Bringing that practical humanitarian step into the main sequence.
Then, Russia's unilateral transfer of the 6,000 Ukrainian bodies, again, integrating those earlier points.
Got it. What's next in their proposed sequence?
Signing a formal memorandum on the ceasefire itself. This memo would apparently lock in specific dates for implementing all those conditions from Part 2 and set a date for signing the final peace treaty.
Okay, so a commitment to the conditions and a deadline for the final deal.
Then establish a 30-day ceasefire regime. This 30-day period would start the moment Ukraine begins withdrawing its forces from those territories Russia claims.
A 30-day window triggered by withdrawal.
And crucially, the proposal demanded that the full withdrawal from Russian territory and the full implementation of that whole package of ceasefire conditions happen within that 30-day period.
That's an incredibly tight deadline for such major military and policy changes from Ukraine.
It seems very demanding, yes. After that 30-day period, the sequence continued with holding elections and forming new government bodies in Ukraine.
Elections after withdrawal and ceasefire conditions are met.
Then, signing the final peace treaty.
And finally,
getting the treaty approved by a legally binding UN Security Council resolution. Then ratification, entry into force, implementation. The whole formal international process.
so Russia's roadmap is detailed, sequential, links humanitarian steps to major military and political demands on Ukraine within tight timelines, and aims for UN Security Council backing.
That's the picture painted by the source material.
And Ukraine's response to receiving this Russian document?
The sources simply said the Ukrainian side decided to take it away for study and would respond later. No immediate rejection or acceptance reported at that point.
So putting these two proposals side by side, I mean, the gap is immense, isn't it? On territory, status, military alliances, even the conditions for a ceasefire.
It's vast. While you see maybe some common ground or willingness to talk about the immediate humanitarian issues, bodies, prisoners, the fundamental visions for a settlement presented in these reported memorandums are just worlds apart.
Absolutely. And of course, these talks weren't happening in a vacuum. The sources also give us a lot of the international context surrounding this Istanbul meeting.
That's crucial background. For instance, the Ukrainian delegation apparently did some prep work. Sources say they met with representatives from Germany, the UK, and Italy right before the main talks on June 2nd.
Coordinating positions with key European partners, what were they focused on?
The sources mention coordination on the idea of a leader meeting, pushing for a full ceasefire, and those humanitarian confidence-building measures. Things that were definitely reflected in their subsequent proposal and discussions.
What about the U.S.? Were they physically there?
The sources say no. The U.S. delegation didn't participate directly in this round in Istanbul. No in-person meetings reported between U.S. officials and the Russian or Ukrainian reps there.
But maybe talking behind the scenes.
Seems so.
Yeah.
The sources detailed a phone call the day before the talks between U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio and Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. So high-level contact was happening, just not at the Istanbul table itself.
And U.S. President Trump, he made some comments around this time, didn't he?
He did. Sources report him expressing frustration with the lack of negotiation progress overall. He apparently said he'd act differently if Moscow didn't show more readiness for peace within about 2 weeks, a sort of deadline or at least a warning.
Act differently, meaning more pressure, more sanctions.
Interestingly, the sources say he explicitly noted he didn't see a need for new sanctions right at that moment. The rationale reported was that he didn't want to potentially disrupt whatever deal might be cooking in Istanbul.
So a bit of a carrot and stick, threatening future action, but holding off on immediate new sanctions to give the talks space.
That appears to be the dynamic described in the sources. But even if U.S. President Trump was holding back new broad sanctions, the pressure cooker was still on elsewhere in Washington.
How so?
Sources mentioned legislative efforts, like Senator Lindsey Graham's proposed bill.
What did that bill propose?
Pretty tough stuff, according to reports. Massive 500% tariffs on countries buying Russian energy or uranium, and a ban on buying Russian government bonds. So, significant appetite for more economic pain, even if the White House was temporarily cautious.
And across the pond, the EU, were they also active?
Oh, yes. Sources reported the EU was prepping its 18th package of sanctions against Russia.
18th package. What was reportedly in it?
Restrictions against the Nord Stream pipeline, more measures targeting Russian banks, and lowering the price cap on Russian oil further. Consistent, ongoing pressure from the EU side.
And were the U.S. and EU coordinating these efforts?
Apparently so. Sources mention EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, meeting with Senator Graham specifically to discuss coordinating U.S. and EU sanctions, trying to keep that pressure aligned.
We also heard from NATO countries, particularly those closer to Russia.
Right. The eastern and northern flank countries held a summit in Vilnius and issued a joint statement. It was strongly supportive of Ukraine's path to NATO membership.
What did they say exactly?
The sources quoted them, emphasizing Ukraine's irreversible path to full Euro-Atlantic integration, including NATO membership, and stressing Ukraine's right to choose its own security measures without interference from outside.
So a direct endorsement of Ukraine's position and a rejection of Russia's demand for neutrality coming from NATO members right on Russia's doorstep.
Exactly. A clear signal from that group. And one more piece of crucial context the sources highlighted. Just before these talks started, there were Ukrainian drone attacks on airfields deep inside Russia.
Drone attacks right before negotiations.
Yes. The Russian MOD reported attacks in Irkutsk and Murmansk regions, causing fires on some planes, though no casualties mentioned, and other attacks reportedly repelled in Amur, Ivanovo, and Ryazan regions. It just underscores the intense military reality that formed the backdrop to these diplomatic efforts.
A very tense backdrop indeed. Now, you mentioned earlier we needed to circle back to the issue of the children. The sources suggest this was a really contentious point.
Extremely contentious. And the narratives presented by each side, according to the source material, were just fundamentally different.
Let's unpack that. What were the Ukrainian claims, as reported?
The sources mentioned Ukraine initially citing huge numbers of children allegedly stolen or forcibly transferred by Russia. The figures mentioned fluctuated wildly, starting maybe as high as 1.5 million, then revised down to 200,000, and then later around 20,000.
Those are massive, though varying numbers. What was the Russian response reported during the talks?
They reportedly asked for specifics, documentation, lists of names, statements from parents, basically, evidence to back up these large claims.
And did Ukraine provide a list?
According to Medinsky's account in the sources, the actual list of names they received during these talks contained 339 names.
339 names. That's a vastly different number than 20,000 or 1.5 million.
A huge discrepancy, yeah.
Yeah.
The Russian side also presented their own figures on children returned.
What did they claim?
Sources say the Russian Children's Rights Ombudsman's office reported returning 101 Ukrainian children to their families, and in turn, that Ukraine had returned 22 Russian children.
Okay, so they presented numbers of returns happening. How did Medinsky frame the whole issue from Russia's perspective?
Very forcefully, according to the sources. He flatly stated there are no kidnapped children. His reported position was that these children were saved by Russian soldiers from conflict zones, sometimes, he claimed, at great risk to the soldiers themselves.
Saved, not kidnapped. That's the core of their counter-narrative.
Yes. He reportedly explained their process. If parents or legal relatives, he mentioned aunts, grandmothers, grandfathers specifically, are found, the child is returned. Family reunification is the goal, as they presented it.
Did he address the Ukrainian accusations directly?
He did. He called it a show, designed to appeal to Europeans, even comparing it to the movie Wag the Dog, implying it was a manufactured PR campaign.
A strong accusation. Did he offer any other justification?
He used an analogy, the famous Soviet monument in Berlin, of Sergeant Maslov saving a German girl under fire. He reportedly said Russian soldiers are doing the same thing now, saving children, framing it as heroism, not abduction.
And the numbers. Did he stick to the lower figures?
He reiterated that the issue involves dozens of children, not thousands or millions, and repeated they weren't kidnapped.
What about the list of 339 names they did receive?
He said they'd investigate those names to see who is actually in Russia. He suggested, based on past experience, some might be in Donbass or Novorossiya or maybe even in Europe. He cited a specific recent case where he claimed 150 kids from a similar list were found living in Germany, despite accusations against Russia.
So, casting doubt on the lists themselves.
And he ended, reportedly, by calling the whole thing a shameful PR campaign that should stop, asserting that Russia considers it a matter of honor to reunite every child with their parents.
So you have Ukraine alleging mass abductions with huge varying numbers, and Russia vehemently denying it, claiming rescue and reunification for a much smaller number, and accusing Ukraine of propaganda, a completely polarized issue based on the source reports.
Absolutely polarized. It's helpful now maybe to look at how some of the experts quoted in the sources interpreted the overall talks. What sense did they make of it all?
Good idea. What did Dmitry Suslov make of it, for example?
Suslov had a few key takeaways. On those drone strikes right before the talks, he felt they were likely intended to disrupt the process, but ultimately didn't affect the outcome because Russia didn't, let's say, rise to the bait.
Didn't react provocatively.
Right. He also thought that despite the obvious massive disagreements on a final political deal, the Istanbul results were actually quite positive.
Positive. In what sense?
Specifically because of the progress reported on the humanitarian track, the bodies, the prisoners. He saw these as crucial confidence-building measures.
Okay. Steps that keep the door open, even if the main issues are deadlocked.
Exactly. Things that allow the diplomatic process itself to just keep going. He also suggested neither side really wants to be seen as the one who walks away from the table, partly because they might be wary of how U.S. President Trump would react.
Interesting point about the Trump factor influencing their willingness to keep talking. What about the other expert mentioned, Igor Istomin?
Istomin had a slightly different angle on the drone strikes. He speculated Ukraine might have been trying to provoke a Russian overreaction.
Why?
To potentially blame Russia for scuttling the talks and maybe push U.S. President Trump away from his recent slight softening and back towards a policy of total, unlimited support for Kyiv.
A calculated provocation, perhaps? Did he think it worked?
No, his analysis was that Russia, while annoyed by the attacks, recognized they didn't fundamentally alter the strategic balance. Ukraine didn't gain major ground, so Russia didn't see a reason to cancel the meeting over it.
But Russia might respond later.
Istomin suggested Russia reserves the right to respond strategically down the line. A lack of immediate retaliation doesn't mean no response ever.
Did he see any impact of the attacks on Russia's negotiating stance?
He thought it might have actually reinforced Russia's view that any final settlement absolutely must guarantee no future threats can emerge from Ukraine, connecting the immediate attacks back to their long-term security demands regarding Ukraine's status and military.
And his overall view on the talks prospects?
Pretty cautious. He highlighted the core disagreements, NATO, military limitations as the major roadblocks. While acknowledging the process continues, he warned against putting too much hope in talks alone.
What did he think would make a difference?
His conclusion, as reported, was blunt. The military situation. Developments on the ground, he believes, will be the ultimate factor determining if and when Kyiv might shift its position on those fundamental issues.
So both experts acknowledge the talks continue, maybe some humanitarian progress, but see huge obstacles and point to external factors, Trump's stance, the battlefield reality as key drivers.
That's a fair summary of their perspectives as presented in the source material. They offer useful lenses for interpreting these complex events.
Okay, let's try to pull this all together then. From the source material we've reviewed in this deep dive, we saw the Istanbul meeting setup, that key pre-meeting between the delegation heads.
We detailed the practical discussions, those agreements on body exchanges, 6,000 for 6,000, depending on who you ask, and that potentially large-scale prisoner swap for the wounded and young soldiers. Plus, the idea of medical commissions.
We laid out the core proposals in those memorandums. Ukraine's insistence on sovereignty, Western ties, no neutrality, full territory back. Russia's demands for neutrality, military limits, territorial recognition of their gains, and that very conditional ceasefire plan.
A massive gulf between those two visions. We also unpacked that deeply contentious issue of the children, with the conflicting narratives of mass abduction versus rescue and reunification.
And we placed it all in the international context, the U.S. calls and comments, the EU sanctions packages, the NATO flank countries' statements supporting Ukraine's NATO path, and those drone attacks right before the talks.
Yeah, and you really see that contrast, based on the sources, some movement, or at least discussion, on the immediate humanitarian front.
Which some experts see as maybe confidence building.
Right, allowing talks to limp along. But then you have these stark fundamental clashes revealed in the settlement proposals themselves. Territory, status, alliances, the core issues.
And hovering over it all, as the sources and experts consistently suggest, is the reality on the ground. The military situation seems to cast a very long shadow over these peace discussions.
It really does. So, thinking about everything we've unpacked from the sources, given these detailed but diametrically opposed proposals, given the influence of the battlefield, the international pressures, what realistically has to give? Where does change need to come from militarily, politically, externally to even begin bridging that enormous gap we've seen laid bare in Istanbul?
Subscribe to our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube.
We're here to make things clear. New episodes every day.